Okay, let's move on to what are called defense mechanisms. Now, this is still all Freud, okay? But we have these defense mechanisms. So, in Freudian terms, they are the unconscious strategies that people use to reduce anxiety by distorting reality and concealing the sources of anxiety from themselves. So unconsciously, you have these strategies put in place in order to reduce anxiety by any sort of distorted reality that you may have. So if something is causing you a lot of anxiety or something would cause a lot of anxiety, you have these defense mechanisms in place that come into play in order to take care of those anxious thoughts. The major or primary defense mechanism is repression. And so your ego, remember you had your id, your ego, and your superego. The ego pushes the unacceptable or unpleasant thoughts and impulses out of your consciousness, but maintains them in your unconscious. So a lot of individuals, if they are very young and they have something very traumatic that happens to them, let's say like rape or incest, right? And it is so traumatic for them to think about and deal with because they are young. And this can happen in older individuals also, but we usually talk about repression a lot in younger individuals. It would be so traumatic for them to deal with. And so they repress those memories. They put them into their unconscious so that they don't have to deal with them. That's what we're talking about with repression. Now, you can see in this next slide, this is figure 3 on your textbook, and it gives the various defense mechanisms that are in place. We talked about repression, but you can see there is also regression, displacement, rationalization, denial, projection, sublimation, and reaction formation. Freud said you have all of these in place to kind of deal with the various problems that you may be having. So what I want to do in this slide is just kind of go back and look at Freud's legacy, we should say, and what we got out of, for as crazy as Freud was, and he was pretty out there in his thoughts and beliefs, we do owe a lot to Freud. There are still some Freudian techniques that are in place today that we use. So some of Freud's general ideas are widely accepted. A lot of them are not accepted and are no longer in place, but some of them are still widely accepted. We have unconscious thoughts that influence our behavior. That is still a belief that we have. We know that we have these defense mechanisms in place, like repression. We still talk about repression quite a bit today in the clinical field, and we got that out of Freud. So we do employ some of those defense mechanisms. Excuse me. Some adult psychological problems have their roots in childhood difficulties. When people go into a therapeutic setting for whatever problem they may be having, right? Eventually it will come back to talking about their childhood, what their parents were like, the environment that they were raised in, things like that. So some of the psychological problems that adults have are rooted in childhood difficulties. However, there is a lack of compelling scientific data to support the process that Freud laid out. So there is no science per se in what Freud did. Freud really didn't talk about research and scientific findings. So we really don't have that science behind it. Freud did generate an important method of treating psychological disturbances, and that is what we know of as psychoanalysis. Now, I want to talk about some other researchers in psychoanalysis that have followed Freud, historically speaking. One of those is Carl Jung, and he talked about what is known as the collective unconscious. Carl Jung is one of the most influential neo-Freudians. He rejected the importance of Freud that he placed on the unconscious sexual urges. Freud was very much into these unconscious sexual urges that were behind so many people's behaviors and thoughts. And Jung really strayed away from that and said, it's not all about these unconscious sexual urges that we have. Jung talked about what is known as the collective unconscious. So, according to Jung, you have this inherited set of ideas and feelings and images and symbols that are shared with all humans because of their common ancestral past. He said that the collective unconscious contains what he referred to as archetypes. And those archetypes are the universal symbolic representation of particular types of people, objects, ideas, or experiences. So he believed that everything that we have in our unconscious is not sexual in nature the way that Freud believed, but it is based on everything that our ancestors had to go through. These various archetypes. And you can read more about them in your textbook also. But one of those examples is the mother archetype. Now, from Jung, we move on to Karen Horney. Karen Horney also had this neo-Freudian perspective. She was one of the earliest psychologists to champion women's issues. She suggested that personality develops in the context of social relationships. And it depends particularly on the relationship between parents and children and how well the child's needs are met. So the first social relationship that you have as children is with your parents. And that social relationship that you have with your parents is very important in developing later social relationships outside of the home. Karen Horney actually rejected Freud's notion of penis envy in women, and she asserted what women envy is actually men's success and freedom. She said that they do not envy that men have a penis, but they do envy that men have a lot more success and freedom than what women do. Karen Horney was also one of the first to stress the importance of cultural factors in the determination of personality. You have to excuse me, I'm fighting this cold right now, and so I apologize that I have to keep coughing. Now we move on to our next neo-Freudian, right? We started with Jung, we went to Karen Horney, and we have our third neo-Freudian, and that is Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler proposed that the primary human motivation that we have is striving for superiority. Not in terms of superiority over others, but in a quest for self-improvement and perfection. That we don't necessarily have this superiority that we want to be better than other people, but we want to be the best person that we can be. We want to strive to be the most that we can be. So it wasn't in reference to others, but it was in reference to ourselves. And he referred to what we call the inferiority complex. So when we do not achieve that superiority within ourselves, the inferiority complex describes adults who have not been able to overcome their feelings of inadequacy, and so they developed as children a lack of self-worth. So they will make others feel bad because they themselves feel bad. It's better to make someone else feel worse than what you feel about yourself. And then we do have two others, Erik Erikson and Anna Freud, who was actually Freud's daughter. They focused on the social and cultural factors behind personality. And we'll talk a little bit about those later on then too. Okay, so here ends module 40. Okay.